Well, Netanyahu and the Israelis just scored a huge PR win in their ongoing war against Gaza, against the Palestinians in Gaza. And that win came when they bombed and completely leveled a building in Gaza, which apparently housed the offices of both Al Jazeera and the Associated Press. Now, the journos were quite taken aback by this. They were, of course, horrified that Israel would come in and destroy their offices and would, pretty much end fake news, at least. Or I shouldn't say end it, but hinder it to a certain extent, because it makes it a lot harder for journalists to do their jobs, smearing whoever their targets are if they don't have a place to work. And at first I thought, gee, that might have been a bad move on Bibi's part, targeting the journos, because now they're going to go real hard against him. Because, I mean, for the most part, while you do get, you kind of, the right in America always, has said that, oh my gosh, the media is so anti-Israel, they hate the Jews. The U.S. media goes pretty darn easy on the Israelis. They put up a fight a little bit against Israel when they do stuff like this, but it's pretty. They treat them with kid gloves. I mean, if anything, you could call them controlled opposition. And so my first reaction when I saw this building collapse after being bombed by Israel, I thought, oh, maybe this could be a turning point in the media and the establishment, of course, because the media and the establishment are one and the same. They might start to turn pretty hard against Israel, at least in this particular instance, in this particular conflict. They might say, you know what, Bibi, you've gone too far this time. You blew up the journos. But what I hadn't properly taken into account initially was the positive backlash that this would generate, the goodwill that this would generate for the Israelis in anti-establishment circles, because all of your anti-establishment voices here in the West hate the media. That's a pretty universal sentiment. People of all different ideologies, if they are a thinking person, if they care about much of anything, if they're a decent person who you can have a conversation with, they hate the media. And so by leveling their office building, which of course housed residences too, there were a lot of innocent people who lived there, of course. And I don't think that the journos necessarily deserved to have their building blown up. I wouldn't go that far. I think most people are kind of tongue in cheek, going like, yeah, the AP and Al Jazeera, they had it coming. Those dirty smear merchants, those fake newsmen. But there is a pretty general consensus that no, this isn't really a bad thing at all, and the media had it coming. And so this might have taken some people who were on the fence about this issue and put them into Israel's camp and say, you know what? I might not like the Israelis or how much control or how much influence they exert over my government, but at least they're taking on the journos. When it comes to issues this serious, though, I do think that's not something that I really like to see, because when you're talking about wars, that's a little bit more serious than, okay, do you like the media or do you not? Because if the media, most of the time the media is on the wrong side when it comes to war. The media is always very much in favor of war. But when it comes to this particular case, just because the media maybe is not all in favor of Israel, you shouldn't just cheer on the Israeli war effort because the Israelis, bombed a news building. I try and chuckle a little bit at it, and I do think that there's a lot of tongue-in-cheek built into this, but at the end of the day, it's not a good instinct that people have. I mean, heck, what made Assange and WikiLeaks famous, at least here in America, was that they leaked that the United States military killed journalists who worked for the Associated Press. Now, if the tape Collateral Murder, if that had come out these days, would that have been something that made people more in favor of the Iraq War? Because at the time, it was something that was considered so damaging to the cause of the Iraq War that people were shamed into not even watching it. And they said, "Oh my gosh, if you watch that, you're anti-American. This is an evil Russian propaganda video released by Russians known as WikiLeaks." But I mean, Collateral Murder was just the U.S. military shooting journalists in the streets. It wasn't blowing up their entire office building. Now, from what I understand, this building that had Al Jazeera and the Associated Press in it, they were told ahead of time by the Israelis to evacuate. So I don't think that any of their people died. I'm sure that somebody probably died. I mean, they're blowing up buildings in the middle of a city. So I mean, people are going to die. But I mean, seriously, I understand, again, few people are going to have a bigger problem with the corporate media in the West than I do. I mean, I've been pretty solidly in the anti-media camp for a long time. But if the Collateral Murder tape came out today, seriously, would people go, "Oh, okay, the U.S. Army is cool now, the Iraq War is cool now because they killed a journalist"? Because I think people are, somewhat serious when they praise Israel for doing this. Now, at the same time, though, I'm not going to be as outraged as your average journo will about this. Even though I do find it troubling, I don't find it any more troubling than Israel blowing up any of the other apartment buildings that they've been doing, because they can say, "Oh, well, it was also home to, one terrorist we confirmed lives in that building, so we got to blow up the whole building." It's like, okay, but then we're going to give everyone a warning to get out. So it's like, okay, so you're just trying to punish the guy by blowing up his apartment, even though you're not going to kill him, because you're going to tell everybody ahead of time that the building is going to be blown up. So you're just going to destroy a bunch of people's homes to spite one person, because you think that'll deter him in the future, maybe, instead of inspire everyone else in that building to become terrorists too, as in your definition. I mean, if I lived in Gaza and Israel blew up my apartment building because there was one guy that Israel didn't like out of the entire, 6-story mid-rise, building that Israel didn't like, they blew up the whole thing, including where I lived. What I would do is I would probably say, well, I've got nothing to lose now. I may as well go and fight Israel. I mean, they blew up my home, F them. And so I want to make it clear. I don't think that it is a particularly bad thing compared to everything else that Israel's doing right now, that they blew up this building where Al Jazeera and the AP worked. But, typically when Israel is, in a war with Gaza and they're blowing up these apartment buildings, it's something that the pro-Israel folks just kind of try and dismiss. And they go like, "Oh, well, that's not big of a deal because, Gaza shoots rockets into Israel, don't you know?" So it doesn't matter if they blow up these big apartment buildings. And there was, one terrorist who lived in there, they kind of try and get around that, where they don't openly praise it. And, you don't see pro-Israel people reposting videos of apartment buildings being demolished by Israeli bombs. That's something that they kind of try and steer away from. Whereas right now, you're seeing a lot of people openly sharing this video of the news building getting blown up and demolished and praising it. Because I guess what I'm getting at is that people might be more callous than I thought. I tend to think that when you have really, really bad things going on in the world and people don't acknowledge it, it's because they're ignoring it, not necessarily because they agree with it. I have sort of the idea that, if you just bring the atrocities of the world to the forefront of everyone's attention, people will wake up and realize, hey, this is a really bad thing. When I think about the war in Yemen, I think that, most Americans are just ignorant of it, not that they support it. But if there was a video of, let's say, a bunch of children who are emaciated and dehydrated, dying in the desert in Yemen, if that was getting shared around on Twitter by conservatives and saying, "Yay, look, we're getting rid of those awful, terrible Yemenis," and praising it, that would be really bad. that would be the biggest black pill. That would make me realize, gee, my fellow citizens really are just evil. And I've also felt the same way about because living in America, you have to deal with a lot of there's a lot of American Zionists that know it's not just the Jewish people. A vast majority of them are not Jewish. Jewish people are a very small minority here in the United States. Not enough to really impact these things. You have big voting blocks of non-Jewish Zionists in this country, and I like to think that they don't necessarily endorse the violence. It's just more something that they try not to think about. Like when I think of some ordinary people like my grandparents who have like an "I stand with Israel" bumper sticker. Okay, it's just a bumper sticker. I don't think that when I see that bumper sticker, I don't think, oh, gee, my grandparents, love to turn on the TV and see apartment buildings collapsing into rubble, and they clap and say, "Yay, yay, Israel." I don't think that they're like that. But when you see conservatives on Twitter sharing around a video of Israel demolishing a building and praising it, I don't know where to go at that point. I mean, then they're just kind of purely reactionary. And again, as I've said this week so much, because, again, to reiterate, I don't like talking about this topic. I wish I didn't have to, but I mean, it's all over the news, and it is important. Most of the time when the news has something all over it, like Liz Cheney, that I also refuse to talk about, that's something that's totally unimportant. But what is going on with Israel is important, so I do feel compelled to talk about certain things regarding it. But when you hear me voicing my criticisms here of what Israel's doing, that again is not an endorsement of the Palestinian cause necessarily, or I should say of the people who are leading the Palestinian cause, because I have my problems with them as well. I do, however, it's pretty obvious that Israel is the bigger bad guy, since they're the ones with more power, and they have the ability to inflict a lot more pain than the Palestinian side does. But I look at this a lot like the Troubles in Ireland. I don't really have a side in the Troubles in Ireland, whether it's the Catholics or the Protestants. It's a conflict that I'm not directly involved with, and to which I don't think there's necessarily where there's a pure good guy in that sense. I think you have two groups of people who have grievances between one another that haven't been solved, and that doesn't mean to say that they commit acts of evil in equal quantities. At different times, it might be one group who's doing worse things than the other, and so it's just not a situation where I could pick a side. I can criticize each side when they do something wrong, but I can't hold one of them up and say, hey, these are the good guys. So I feel like I've been rambling about this for a long time, because there wasn't really a whole lot that I had to say about this matter. But to sum it up, I thought that the right in this country, since as a part of sort of the change that came with Trump, the new reevaluation of foreign policy, the idea of America first and stuff, was leading to more people no longer becoming these 100% shill for Israel types. And I had hoped that meant that people were gaining a more nuanced understanding of the situation, that they were going to think about it, logically and say, well, gee, there's a lot to consider here. It's a very complicated issue, and maybe we shouldn't just blanket say Israel is always right. And while that is the truth, or while that did come to pass, while it is true that a lot of people on the right no longer just automatically assume that Israel is always right, that doesn't mean that they have replaced that rule with logic and reason. Ultimately, however, it shouldn't be that big of a deal, because what my fellow Americans think about what's going on in Israel ideally should not have much bearing on life here in America. So, with that said, I think I'll end it there for today.